reawakening because they were political,
Yeah.
they were artistic collaborators. My mother ran a theater and cooked the breakfast and knew where we all.
At 63 years old, Nell Newman, the daughter of Hollywood icon Paul Newman, finally broke her silence. In a jaw-dropping CBS Sunday Morning interview, she opened up for the very first time, revealing truths that shook the shiny illusion Hollywood had been protecting for decades. Behind those world-famous blue eyes, the same eyes that melted hearts across generations, wasn't the image of a perfect dad or devoted husband the world believed in. Instead, Nell painted a haunting picture, one of a man split between two completely different worlds. One life sparkled under the bright Hollywood lights, surrounded by fame, cameras, and adoration. But the other? It was hidden deep in the shadows, a secret life dedicated to the person he truly loved. The most shocking twist of all came after his death, written coldly in black ink, his will. Every trace of his family's name was erased, his immense fortune handed to one mysterious man, identified only by two initials, RR. But who was RR? What power did this person hold over Paul Newman, a man celebrated as one of the greatest legends of all time? What kind of love was so deep, so forbidden, that it stayed buried until his dying breath? These are the answers that Nell promised to expose in her bombshell confession. Westport, Connecticut, a quiet paradise for the rich and powerful, seemed like the perfect backdrop for a family built on love and success. But behind the polished gates of the Newman estate, little Nell discovered a cold truth long before most kids ever could. She remembered sitting beneath an old oak tree, sketching quietly while the breeze carried whispers through the air, whispers that warned her never to ask the wrong questions. "In our house," she once said, "there were questions that, if spoken aloud, would cost you your parents' love." How heartbreaking is that? Nell confessed she used to think her family was perfect, just like those flawless portraits hanging on the walls, frozen behind glass. "But photographs don't speak," she said, "and neither did my family." In all her memories, she had never once seen her parents hold hands, not even once. Every public embrace, every smile before the cameras, lasted just long enough for the flash to go off. Then the warmth vanished. It was like watching two actors forcing themselves to finish a scene they no longer believed in. Paul Newman, the man whose eyes made the world fall in love, turned cold and distant once the cameras stopped rolling. Joanne Woodward, the graceful, beautiful actress adored by fans, became distant too, retreating into silence whenever he entered the room. Nell recalled one painful moment. "There was a time I tried to hold my mother's hand while she was washing dishes and asked, 'Are you sad?' She pulled her hand away like she'd touched fire." That's when Nell realized her mother wasn't angry. She was broken. She just didn't know how to reach out when feelings got involved. Her touch froze at the edge of emotion, as if affection itself was something dangerous. Every morning, Paul Newman vanished before sunrise without a word, leaving behind only the echo of the front door closing. Sometimes he'd be gone a couple of days, sometimes weeks. And when he finally returned, he'd toss a faint smile, mutter a cold hello, and lock himself away in his study. No explanations, no warmth, nothing. From behind that closed door, Nell would sometimes hear him laughing, a deep, private kind of laughter that didn't belong in that quiet, tense house. But what stung most was that the voice on the other end of those long-distance calls never once belonged to her mother. Then came that unforgettable winter night in 1972. Nell was just a child when she heard the sharp crash of glass echo through the halls. She ran to her mother's room and froze. Joanne Woodward was kneeling on the floor, gripping a broken wine glass, her hand trembling, her eyes empty. Through tears, she whispered again and again, "You lied again. You lied again." Terrified, Nell asked, "What did Father do?" Joanne looked at her with trembling lips and whispered words that would scar Nell forever. "Not every man loves women, darling, but Hollywood will never accept that." That moment shattered her world. Sometime later, Nell stumbled upon a secret that confirmed everything, an old Polaroid that had slipped out of her father's wallet. The photo showed Paul Newman smiling wide, his arm wrapped tightly around another man, and it wasn't the casual touch of friendship. His eyes were glowing with the kind of love no script could fake. When Nell, in her innocence, brought the photo to her mother, Joanne's reaction was explosive. She snatched the picture, tore it to shreds, and threw it straight into the fireplace. As the photo curled in the flames, she whispered coldly, "We will never speak of this. Never." The silence that followed was deafening. From that day forward, Nell knew there were rules in that house. Rules carved into the very walls. Never ask where her father disappeared to. Never question why her mother needed pills just to fall asleep. Never talk about why her parents slept on separate floors, like strangers in the same mansion. And above all, never, ever ask about love. Their home was a museum of golden memories, walls lined with Oscars, glossy magazine covers, and smiles that didn't reach their eyes. "We lived surrounded by walls covered in portraits," Nell once said, her voice shaking, but not a single one spoke of happiness. Whenever guests arrived, big names like Gore Vidal, Robert Redford, or mysterious visitors from New York, everything changed. Paul would dress sharp, polish his charm, and put on that irresistible movie star grin. But beneath that flawless performance, Nell could sense it. He was playing a role, even at home. Every night ended the same way, with the heavy click of Paul Newman's bedroom door locking behind him. No one dared to ask who he had been entertaining, or why he preferred to keep it hidden. Joanne would quietly slip away before midnight, her face pale, eyes swollen, like someone who had cried herself empty. Nell later said, "We had portraits that looked flawless, but our hearts were hollow." Everything around them was staged, every smile rehearsed, and the cruelest part was that she used to think she was the problem for feeling that emptiness. As the years passed, Nell began noticing the cracks more clearly. One night, she caught her father alone in the kitchen, staring at a crumpled letter under the dim yellow light. Without hesitation, he lit it on fire, the lighter engraved with the mysterious initials GV. The flames flickered in his eyes like guilt. When Nell asked softly, "Who was that letter for?" he looked straight at her and said quietly, "Don't become someone I have to keep a secret from." Those words burned deeper than the fire in his hand. But the memory that haunted Nell most was something even more chilling. A night when her mother, in a sleepwalking daze, mumbled words that would echo forever. "I'm not jealous of women. I'm just afraid I'll never be enough compared to him." That one sentence tore open the hidden truth their family had stitched shut for decades. It was the moment everything they pretended to be began to crumble. And the first person who dared to tear that veil completely, her brother, Scott Newman. Scott was the one who broke the family's unspoken rule: never question the silence. And he paid the ultimate price for it. Nell's voice cracked during her 2025 CBS interview as she said, "He was the first to say out loud what we'd all been choking on, the truth that was killing us from the inside." Scott Newman, Paul's eldest son, his so-called rebellious double, grew up in the spotlight's glare. To the world, he was the heir to a Hollywood dynasty, expected to shine just as bright, to be every bit as charming, manly, and flawless as his father. But behind the glitz, he saw something darker. The spotlight wasn't fame. It was the heat of a tragedy slowly building to explode. From the time he was a teenager, Scott had questions no one else dared to ask. Why had he never seen his parents show affection, not even a simple touch? Why did his mother cry alone at night while his father sat downstairs, silent, glass in hand, pretending not to hear? And the hardest question of all, why was his father always surrounded by men who clearly weren't just friends? "I can still hear my mother sobbing through the walls," Nell recalled tearfully. Scott would grab his guitar and smash it against the floor until the neck snapped in two, while our father just sat downstairs, pouring himself another drink and watching the evening news like nothing was wrong. The house was filled with trophies, awards, and silence, the kind that hurts more than shouting ever could. Then came the breaking point, 1974. A party at a classmate's house turned into a nightmare that would change everything. A drunk teenager, thinking he was funny, sneered across the room, "Hey, Scott, maybe you should ask your dad if he likes men or women before you try to be like him." The room froze. Scott's rage exploded, years of humiliation, confusion, and bottled pain bursting out all at once. He lunged at the boy, fists flying until the kid hit the floor, bleeding and broken. It took 3 people to pull Scott off him. The boy needed 6 stitches, and by the next week, the story had spread through the entire town like wildfire. Scott got expelled. And when it happened, Paul Newman didn't show up. Not at the school, not at home, nowhere. Instead, he sent a lawyer carrying a check and a rehearsed apology, the kind of silence money can buy. No fatherly talk, no hand on the shoulder, no "we'll get through this." Nothing. When Scott came home that night, he was shaking with rage. He grabbed his old award certificate, the one that once made him proud, and threw it straight into the fireplace. The paper curled in the flames as he screamed, "You don't protect me. You don't protect Mom. Then who are you, really?" His voice echoed through the mansion like a siren, but the only answer was silence. No footsteps, no apology, just the sound of burning paper and unspoken truth. A year later, Nell found something hidden. A small notebook tucked under Scott's mattress, its pages wrinkled and stained with tears. She held onto it for years, unable to let go. Inside were words that shattered her heart. "If he doesn't love Mom, then who am I? Am I just an accident or the cover for his secret? Was I born out of love or out of lies?" Those questions wrapped around Nell's throat like a rope she couldn't untie. Then came the explosion that rocked Hollywood. 1977. Confidential Weekly published a grainy black and white photo that set the entire industry on fire. The picture, taken in 1959 at Malibu Beach, showed a man who looked exactly like Paul Newman walking barefoot in the sand, hand in hand with another man. Both wore crisp white shirts and rolled-up slacks, casual yet intimate. There were no kisses, no embraces, just the kind of look between them that said everything without a word. Hollywood didn't dare print it as fact, but the whispers were louder than ever. Tabloids splashed headlines like, "Who is the man in Paul's life?" and "The hidden truth behind a masculine icon." Studios panicked, fans buzzed, and inside the Newman home, the silence grew heavier than ever. At that same moment, Scott was on the verge of his big break, about to sign his first major action film contract. It was supposed to be his fresh start, his way to finally step out from his father's shadow. But then, without warning, the deal was gone. The studio dropped him overnight. No explanation, no call. He only caught a whisper from a producer saying, "Audiences won't buy you as a hero if your dad's living a double life." That single sentence crushed him. That night, the fury inside Scott boiled over. He smashed the bathroom mirror, the shards slicing his reflection into pieces. Then, trembling, he dragged a razor across his wrist. Not deep, just enough to let out the pain. When Joanne found him, blood trickling down his arm, she screamed so loud the neighbors heard, but Paul wasn't there. He was in New York. The papers said he was with a close companion. After that, Scott's world fell apart. He changed his number, cut off everyone who cared, and sank into drugs. Not to feel high, but to numb the sting of being unwanted. Nell later said with tears, he wasn't chasing a thrill. He was trying to drown out the look in our father's eyes, that cold indifference the whole world mistook for charm. She remembered calling him once, desperate to check on him. He answered, sighed, and then the line just went dead, Nell whispered. The last words he ever said to her were heavy enough to crush her heart. "Do you think Dad ever truly loved anyone?" She couldn't answer, because deep down, she didn't know. 1 month later, November 20th, 1978, the police broke down the door of Scott's small Los Angeles apartment. What they found inside would end the Newman family's silence forever. They found Scott lying lifeless on the living room floor, the TV still glowing, frozen on the image of Paul Newman smiling on stage as he accepted an award for Slapshot. Right beside Scott were a few scattered pills and half a bottle of red wine, like the final props in a tragedy no one wanted to admit was real. The report was cold and brief. No signs of violence. Cause of death, suspected suicide due to overdose. But Nell, just 18 at the time, knew better. She knew in her bones that Scott hadn't died from drugs or alcohol. He died from silence. He died from the unbearable weight of questions no one in that family dared to answer. The question that haunted him, did our father ever live in truth? And if he didn't, what did that make us? That loss cracked something open inside Nell. From the ashes of that heartbreak, she began to see her family's legacy for what it really was. Not a golden story, but a fortress of secrets layered so thickly that no light could break through. Then came the night that changed everything, winter of 1981. The wind outside howled through the trees of the Newman estate in Westport, snow piling up against the windows like nature itself was trying to bury the truth. Nell, now 22, wandered through the hallway, wrapped in a thin sweater, just looking for another blanket. But halfway to the kitchen, she froze. A faint glow slipped from beneath the half-closed door of her father's study. The warm, yellow light spilled across the floor like a secret begging to be discovered. But what really stopped her wasn't the light. It was the sound, a deep, weary sigh. Not the kind an actor rehearses before a scene, not the tired breath of a man after a phone call. It was the kind of sigh that comes from a heart carrying too much truth. Nell's pulse quickened. She crept closer, careful not to make the floorboards creak, and peeked through the narrow gap in the door. Inside, Paul Newman sat alone at his desk. No camera crew, no audience, no mask. Just him, a fountain pen, and a thick stack of paper that he was writing on with desperate intensity. On the desk lay no movie script, no foundation documents, nothing business-related, just pages filled with his familiar, elegant handwriting. But the name at the top wasn't Joanne. Her eyes locked on the first line, and her world tilted. "Dear Red, the one who reminds me that I am still human, not just a symbol." Her breath caught. Red. That could only mean one person, Robert Redford. In that instant, all those unspoken childhood questions, every awkward silence, every missing touch, every cold look, suddenly made sense. The letter wasn't about fame or films or the trophies stacked high in his office. It was a confession, written in ink, finally honest, finally raw. Paul wrote about the look in Redford's eyes when they stood side by side in the Utah desert, shooting the last scene of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. He described the way Redford's hand would brush against his shoulder when no one else was watching, small moments that lingered far longer than any applause. And then he wrote about the nights, the quiet nights, when they'd sit on hotel rooftops after long days on set, sipping whiskey under the stars, saying nothing at all. Two men, terrified that if they spoke the truth out loud, it would stop being their secret and become something real, something the world would never forgive. Nell stood frozen by the door, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. The truth was right there, spilling from her father's pen. The truth that had destroyed her brother, silenced her mother, and haunted her entire life. And for the first time, she understood the tragic cost of a love that dared not speak its name, not in Hollywood, not in that house, and not even within the walls of his own heart. "There was one night you looked at me, only looked, and I felt as if the whole world had forgiven me." Those words from Paul's letter bled straight into Nell's chest. He wrote, "Red, you didn't need to say a word, but if one day you walked into this room and looked at me the way you once did, I would give up everything. The fame, the family, all of Hollywood." Nell's heart was pounding so loud she could barely breathe. Her hands shook so hard she almost dropped the page. This wasn't just a letter. It was a confession, the kind that could destroy everything if anyone else ever read it. Then suddenly, the phone rang in the room next door. The sharp sound cut through the silence like lightning. Paul stood up quickly, leaving the desk. Nell panicked. She slid the pages back into place and hurried out, her footsteps silent but her heart racing. She had just stepped inside her father's hidden world, a vault of secrets that had never been meant to see the light. But one truth had carved itself deep into her mind and would never fade. Her father hadn't been writing to a friend. He had been writing to the one person who truly stirred his heart. Just a few weeks later, everything began to unravel in real life. Joanne Woodward, who was in California shooting a Vogue cover, abruptly canceled her schedule and boarded the earliest flight back to Westport. The reason? A single, chilling, anonymous phone call. No number, no name, just one sentence. "If you still care about your marriage, go to the Mayflower Hotel, room 708. That same night, Paul had told everyone he was in New York meeting with a partner about a new script. That partner, of course, was Robert Redford, the man the press had long whispered about, calling him Paul's soulmate. No one knows exactly what happened behind the door of room 708. The world never found out. But when Joanne came home to Westport the next day, she was ghostly pale. Her arm had a faint bruise, as though someone had grabbed her too tightly. Her eyes, even behind layers of makeup, were swollen and red, the kind of pain that no camera could ever disguise. That night, for the first time in decades, the mansion, normally so silent it felt like a museum, erupted with the sound of chaos. No screaming, no arguing, just the violent crash of breaking glass. Somewhere upstairs, an Italian porcelain lamp, one of Joanne's wedding gifts, shattered into 1,000 pieces. From that night on, something inside Paul Newman changed forever. He started smoking again, the same habit Joanne had begged him to quit back in the 60s. He stopped sleeping. He'd sit outside for hours after midnight, staring into the blackness like he was waiting for someone who'd never come back. Sometimes Nell would find him standing in front of a mirror, frozen, clutching a fountain pen so tightly his knuckles went white, like he wanted to break it in half, but couldn't. One evening, she accidentally dropped a Beatles record while setting the table. Without a word, Paul slammed his hand down, shattering a baccarat crystal vase, the one given to him and Joanne as a wedding gift. He didn't shout, he didn't curse, he just walked out, and the silence he left behind hit harder than any blow. From then on, Joanne began to disappear inside herself. She moved through the house like a ghost, her once bright spirit dimmed to a flicker. The woman who used to greet everyone with laughter now barely spoke at all. She stopped calling Paul honey. She stopped saying, my love. Those words simply died in her mouth. Reporters kept circling, desperate to get a comment, to catch even a glimpse of the truth. And one day, when a journalist dared to ask her about Robert Redford, she looked straight into the camera, her expression cold and distant, and said only 2 words: that man. No warmth, no anger, no trace of the years they had all spent pretending everything was fine, just emptiness, a hollow label for someone who had quietly rewritten her entire life. And from that point forward, everyone in that mansion lived like actors who had forgotten their lines, trapped in the same house, haunted by the same secret, pretending not to know the truth that had already torn them apart. At that time, Nell was still studying ecology, trying to build her own life far away from the glitter and chaos of Hollywood. But little by little, she began to see her parents' marriage for what it truly was, not love, but a performance. A 50-year-long stage play where 2 legendary actors clung to their roles just to keep the set from falling apart. And yet, one lonely letter, one anonymous phone call, and one hotel room had exposed the cracks that had been there from the very beginning. The illusion of perfection was gone, and Nell, now sharper and less naive, started to see things she once ignored. While cleaning her father's study one afternoon, she discovered something chilling. In the back of a drawer, beneath stacks of scripts and correspondence, were handwritten lists of phone numbers, labeled only with single letters, R or T, no full names. Just initials. Some were crossed out, others had strange notes beside them. Call back after 10 p.m. Don't let Joanne know. Her pulse raced as she flipped through more papers, and then she found them. Old faded photographs folded into quarters and tucked behind framed family portraits. Faces she didn't recognize, men whose eyes lingered on her father too long, too tenderly. The affection in those glances wasn't friendly. It was intimate. At first, Nell thought the puzzle was complete, that Robert Redford had been the key to everything. But then came a new shock. Maybe Redford had been the most important, but he wasn't the only one. It was 1981 at New York's legendary Carlyle Hotel, a place where power, fame, and secrets all walked hand in hand under soft golden lights. That night, Nell stopped by the hotel for something simple, to deliver a stack of documents for her mother. She had just come from an internship interview at a TV station, buzzing with hope, her mind full of dreams about her own future. But when the elevator doors slid open, everything inside her froze, as if she'd stepped into a film scene she was never meant to see. Her father, Paul Newman, appeared from the left hallway, but walking beside him was not Joanne. It was Gore Vidal, the celebrated writer, political firebrand, and one of her father's oldest friends. To the public, Gore was part of the family's social circle, witty, brilliant, always around. But what Nell saw that night was not friendship. They walked close, too close. Gore's hand brushed against Paul's wrist and lingered, a small, affectionate touch that spoke volumes. Paul tilted his head and smiled at him in that quiet, knowing way that only lovers share. Both men wore long coats, their steps perfectly in sync, so near that a single gust of air might have pushed their cheeks together. Then, suddenly, Paul looked up and saw her, The look on his face would haunt Nell for the rest of her life. It wasn't the look of a man caught in the act, she told Esquire in a 2018 interview. It was the look of someone silently begging, "Don't say it, please don't." Gore noticed her too and gave a soft smile, as calm as ever, as though nothing at all had happened. Paul said nothing. He just walked straight into the elevator. The doors closed, and Nell stood there, frozen in that marble lobby, holding her mother's documents like they weighed 1,000 pounds. She knew she had just seen the truth, the kind that changes everything. From that night on, Gore Vidal's presence didn't fade. It grew. He started appearing more often, visiting their home under the guise of business or collaboration. Joanne said nothing, but Nell saw the pattern forming again. Late-night phone calls at 2 a.m. that ended abruptly when anyone else entered the room. Trips that were supposed to last 2 days and stretched into 5, with no calls home. And whenever Nell asked where he'd been, Paul would simply say, "Just meetings, nothing important." But she knew. The silence between her parents had turned from ice to stone, unbreakable and suffocating. The house once filled with movie star charm now felt like a haunted theater. Every door closed, every light dimmed, and every truth locked behind walls no one dared to touch. And for Nell, the realization was brutal. Her father's double life wasn't just a rumor whispered by tabloids. It was real, living, breathing, and standing right in front of her that night at the Carlisle Hotel. Handwritten notes began to appear beside the house phone. Short, cryptic messages that made Nell's stomach twist every time she passed by. One read simply, "G called back." Nothing more. No explanation. But Nell knew exactly who G was. Once, she caught a glimpse of her father pulling something from his shirt pocket, a worn black and white photograph. She watched quietly as he looked at it, unaware she was nearby. In the photo, Paul and Gore Vidal sat by a quiet lakeside, leaning back against each other. Their eyes weren't on the camera. They were fixed somewhere far away, lost in the kind of silence that only two souls who've crossed the line of friendship could ever share. It was tenderness caught in time, yet heavy with distance. Like two men who had gone too far to turn back, but were too afraid to move forward. The image haunted Nell. One evening, unable to keep it in any longer, she asked her mother directly, "Do you think Dad isn't the man you always believed he was?" Joanne Woodward, the Oscar-winning actress who had once portrayed a woman with multiple personalities, froze completely. The silence stretched so long that Nell almost wished she could take the question back. Then Joanne finally whispered, her voice trembling but calm. "There are some things no one ever teaches us how to put into words, but they still exist, every single day, even when we pretend to forget." For Nell, that silence was the confession. No more words were needed. Her mother's quiet acceptance spoke louder than any truth she could have said out loud. As for Gore Vidal, he never publicly confirmed anything about his connection with Paul Newman. Yet, in 1995, his memoir, Palimpsest, sent shockwaves through the American literary world. In it, he wrote one simple, devastating line: "There are men who will never belong to us, but every time they smile, we feel alive." He didn't name Paul, he didn't have to. Journalists and insiders instantly knew. Gore had never written anything that intimate about any of the men he'd openly loved. Only one person fit the shadow behind those words, the man who had never confessed a thing. Even years later, in a 2006 interview with Vanity Fair, when a reporter bluntly asked him, "Was Paul Newman the greatest love of your life?" Gore didn't deny it, but he didn't confirm it either. He gave a small shrug, took a slow sip of his drink, and looked straight into the camera. "We shared nights that neither of us ever wanted to leave," he said. "That is all I can say." The studio went silent. You could hear the cameras humming. No one dared ask another question, but Nell didn't need to. She already knew exactly what those words meant. By 2003, time had begun to take its toll on Joanne Woodward, the woman once celebrated for her intelligence and grace, Hollywood's definition of elegance, started to lose her memories. Birthdays slipped away. Faces she had known for years blurred and faded, but there was one memory that never left her, not even as her mind began to dim. One afternoon, as Nell sat beside her during a quiet spell between sleep and wakefulness, Joanne suddenly gripped her daughter's hand tightly. Her voice was faint but clear, trembling with emotion. "Do you know the way your father looked at Gore?" she whispered. "That was a gaze he never once gave to me. And even if I forget everything, even if I lose myself, I will never forget that look." Those words cut through Nell like glass. It was the final confirmation, the quiet truth her family had spent half a century trying to bury under perfection and fame. Joanne Woodward had been seen by the world as the symbol of class and strength, the Hollywood woman who defied the stereotypes of her time. The brilliant actress who won the Academy Award for The Three Faces of Eve, the loyal wife who stood by Paul Newman's side for decades, the same woman he once told Life magazine he would never leave. But behind those headlines, behind the photographs of laughter and love, there was a story too painful to print. A marriage that had become a contract, a partnership bound not by passion but by performance. And through it all, one look, that look between Paul and Gore, was the ghost that would never stop haunting them all. For decades, Paul Newman and Joanne Woodward were worshipped as America's golden couple, the perfect love story, radiant, romantic, and untouchable. Every photo of them seemed to shimmer with devotion, every red carpet smile screamed forever. But that dazzling image had long since faded, leaving behind nothing but echoes of what once was. Now, Joanne sat alone in a quiet nursing home in Westport, Connecticut, far from the glitter and flashbulbs of Hollywood. The faint winter sunlight filtered through the dusty window, soft and cold, landing on her trembling hands. Those same hands had once held Paul Newman's heart for more than 50 years, and now they could barely remember the warmth of it. Alzheimer's had crept into her life like an invisible thief, stealing everything piece by piece. Birthdays, faces, triumphs, laughter, all gone. It took the big memories first, the thrill of her first Broadway role, the Golden Globe applause, the Oscar win for The Three Faces of Eve. Even the glowing nights under the stage lights slipped away, leaving her stranded in a fog of fading time. One afternoon, Nell visited with a photo, an old snapshot from the 1974 Golden Globe Awards. In it, her parents smiled arm in arm, glowing with pride and glamour. Joanne stared at the image for a long, long moment before quietly asking, "Who is this person? Do I know them?" Her voice was soft, fragile, like she was talking about a stranger. But in the haze of confusion, one name never seemed to leave her lips. It wasn't Paul. It wasn't Nell. It wasn't even one of her other children. It was Robert. At first, Nell dismissed it as a random spark from a fading mind, just a meaningless jumble of letters floating through her mother's memory. But then the nurses began whispering, exchanging uneasy looks whenever Nell walked in. They said that some nights, Joanne would suddenly awaken in the darkness, her eyes glassy but her voice disturbingly sharp, as if the truth had clawed its way out from the past. They said she would speak softly, but with uncanny precision, about things no one else could possibly know. She talked about the strange perfume that used to linger on her husband's clothes, one nurse confessed, and phone calls that went unanswered, always from the Essex House Hotel in New York. Another whispered about how Joanne would murmur half-dreaming details that didn't belong to her at all. A single golden hair left behind on a white pillow, a laugh that wasn't hers, and a name that slipped out again and again. Robert. These weren't the scattered memories of a lost mind. They were fragments of something real, echoes of the betrayal that had haunted her for decades. Every night, as Joanne drifted in and out of consciousness, she seemed to return to the same ghost, the one truth she had buried under years of red carpets, interviews, and forced smiles. And though her mind had forgotten almost everything else, one emotion stayed, that ache in her chest every time she remembered the way her husband once looked at another man. The look she could never unsee. Even as Alzheimer's erased her world, that look lived on, sharper than any memory, deeper than any wound. And then, one night, Joanne finally spoke, her voice weak but weighted with decades of pain. Slowly, painfully, she uttered the name that had haunted her all those years. Robert Redford. The words cut through the quiet like thunder. Nell froze. That name, she had heard it only once before, almost 40 years earlier when she was 17. Back then, she had skipped school, sneaked onto a train to New York, and found herself standing in the grand marble lobby of the Essex House Hotel, the same place her mother now mentioned in her fading whispers. She had been hiding behind a column, clutching her backpack, when the elevator doors opened, and there he was, Her father, Paul Newman, dressed sharp as ever in a gray suit, his hair slicked back, his charm effortless. But he wasn't alone. Beside him was Robert Redford, Hollywood's golden boy, the man the world had always called his closest friend. Nell had watched in stunned silence as her father reached out, gently resting his hand on Redford's shoulder. The gesture was small, but so intimate it felt like she was seeing something she wasn't supposed to see. They laughed quietly together, not the polite laughter for cameras, but the kind that belongs only to people who understand each other completely. Their eyes met in a way that needed no explanation, no words, a moment so natural, so real, that it made every stage photograph she'd ever seen of her parents feel hollow. In that moment, Nell's teenage heart didn't know what to feel: confusion, fear, or heartbreak. She convinced herself it was nothing, just a misunderstanding. Maybe she imagined it. She buried the memory deep, locking it away like a dangerous secret she could never tell anyone, especially not her mother. The family's image was already fragile, held together by performance and pride, and one truth could have shattered it all. But now, decades later, hearing her mother speak that same name, muttering details about the same hotel, the same strange perfume, the same unreachable look, everything inside Nell crumbled. All the walls she had built to keep the truth out collapsed in an instant. Joanne's eyes, cloudy with memory and illness, fixed on a photograph resting on her lap, a picture taken years earlier at Rhode Island Beach. It showed the family laughing in the sun, frozen in a moment that looked perfect. Her voice trembled as she whispered, "That was the day he betrayed me." She kept her gaze on the photo, her wrinkled fingers tracing the image of Paul's smile. "In 1985, she said softly, "he told me he was meeting a director to discuss a new script. But I knew. I always knew. Because that look—" She paused, swallowing hard. "That look was never meant for me." Then, as if slipping between past and present, Joanne lowered her head and murmured one final detail, barely above a whisper, fragile as breath. "Essex House, room 1217. Nell felt her chest tighten. That room number, those words, they weren't random. They lined up perfectly with the memory she had tried to erase. The same hotel, the same year, the same air of secrecy. Her mother's trembling confession had just tied every buried thread together. The letter marked Dear Red, the whispers about late-night calls, the photo she had seen decades ago. It all pointed to the same truth, one her family had been too scared to face. Joanne's voice drifted again, fading into exhaustion. "I called all night," she said, tears pooling in her tired eyes. "But no one ever picked up." To anyone else, it might have sounded like meaningless fragments from a fading mind, the disjointed echoes of a woman slipping away. But to Nell, every syllable landed like a hammer blow. Those weren't random words, they were coordinates: time, place, and heartbreak. And in that quiet nursing home room, surrounded by old photographs and fading light, the secret Nell had buried as a teenager finally clawed its way to the surface, undeniable, unstoppable, and real. Nell sat in silence, her chest tight as if a mountain of grief had settled on it. Across from her, her mother, the woman who had forgiven every one of her husband's sins and spent half a century defending the family's spotless image, still remembered everything. Even as illness stole her memories one by one, Joanne's mind clung fiercely to one unshakable detail: a hotel room number that the world was supposed to forget. Even when her mind had dimmed, her heart had not. It remembered the betrayal with perfect clarity, the heartbreak carved so deep that not even Alzheimer's could erase it. Joanne never screamed, she never threw accusations, but every time her tired eyes drifted toward the golden light spilling through the window at sunset, they spoke louder than words ever could. That quiet gaze, sad, hollow, yet sharp as glass, was its own verdict, an unspoken indictment of the man she had once called her everything. One afternoon, Nell finally gathered the courage to ask, "Do you still remember how Dad loved you?" Joanne turned slowly, her clouded eyes soft but steady. Her voice, barely louder than a whisper, trembled like fog rolling through the morning. "I once believed it," she said, "but after that day, I no longer did." Those few words shattered whatever illusion of peace remained. Everything the world had once admired, the golden couple, the model marriage, the fairy tale romance, was gone. What people had worshipped as the perfect example of love now dissolved like soap bubbles under the harsh light of truth. The Newman family had been preparing themselves for a gentle ending. They believed Paul would stay beside Joanne until her final moments, the devoted husband America adored. The headlines would have read like poetry, "Hollywood's most enduring love story, together until the end." But that fantasy was about to collapse, because behind Paul Newman's warm smile, behind those famous blue eyes that had charmed millions, hid a decision so cold and deliberate that it brought his own family to their knees. No one saw it coming. Not Nell, not Joanne, not even those closest to him. The truth was buried inside the pages of his will, a document so carefully constructed that it stripped away the last pieces of the myth he'd built around himself. As Nell read it, her hands began to shake. The deeper her eyes traced each line, the harder it became to breathe. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't forgetfulness. It was intentional, planned years in advance. Paul Newman, the man who had built an empire of generosity and goodwill, the face of Newman's Own, the $100 million salad dressing brand that fed millions through charity, had chosen to leave behind a legacy that shocked everyone who loved him. His fortune wasn't divided the way he had always promised. The wealth wasn't shared among his children, and worst of all, nothing, not a single cent, was left for Joanne. The woman who had stood beside him through every storm, who raised his children, protected his image, endured every headline and whisper. The same woman who was now fading in a nursing home, forgetting names and birthdays. She was written out completely. Nell could barely comprehend it. Her father, the man everyone believed was pure-hearted and selfless, had left his family out of his will entirely. The document that should have been his final act of love turned out to be his final betrayal. And as Nell sat there, the papers trembling in her hands, she realized something that made her stomach drop. This wasn't carelessness. This wasn't confusion. It was designed. Every line, every clause, every signature had been placed with cold precision. Not a single dollar was left for his children. The same children who had stood beside him through decades of struggle, the ones who had carried the Newman name with pride and helped build the wholesome image behind Newman's Own. Every ounce of that legacy, every cent, every share, every piece of the empire was handed to one man and one man only. His name was Robert Forrester, a quiet figure who had lingered for years just out of sight, always in the background, like a faint shadow no one ever paid much attention to. He had been known publicly as Paul's advisor, sometimes called a business associate, but never quite labeled a friend. And yet, here he was, the sole inheritor of a fortune that had once symbolized family, generosity, and trust. When the lawyer read the clause aloud, the room fell silent. His voice didn't shake, but everyone else's world did. Paul had added a brutal condition to his will, a no-contest clause. Anyone who disputes this will lose even the small cash share allotted to them. Nell felt her heart stop. It was as if someone had poured a bucket of ice straight into her chest. Her hands went cold, her breath caught in her throat. She turned to her sister Clea, her voice trembling as she whispered, "We didn't just lose our father. We lost the chance to ever really know who he was." The words hung heavy in the air, a truth none of them could deny. The man who had taught the world about loyalty and kindness had written his final chapter in silence and secrecy. And just when the shock seemed unbearable, something even darker surfaced. A confidential addendum to the will, leaked by a former legal assistant, revealed that Paul Newman had once drafted plans for a private trust he called the Quiet Legacy. The name itself sounded poetic, but its meaning was anything but simple. Hidden in those pages was the most astonishing detail yet. The very first beneficiary listed wasn't his wife. It wasn't his children. It wasn't any charity or foundation. It was a mysterious figure identified only by two initials, RR. Nell's pulse raced. That same pair of letters had appeared once before, in another cold document long ago, tucked inside her father's original estate papers. RR, the same initials that had haunted the family for decades, whispered about but never confirmed. The moment the story broke, Hollywood stopped breathing. Within hours, Vanity Fair and the New York Post ran explosive headlines, both speculating that the mysterious RR listed in Paul Newman's will might in fact stand for Robert Redford. The public went wild. Fans who had spent decades idolizing the two legends were stunned. Those long-buried rumors, the whispers of a secret bond between the two men, suddenly came roaring back with a vengeance. For years, such talk had been brushed off, laughed away, or dismissed as gossip. But now, the puzzle pieces finally seemed to fit, too neatly to ignore. Tabloids, talk shows, and online forums caught fire. Headlines screamed, "Paul's hidden love," and "the secret that could rewrite Hollywood history." The world couldn't believe it, that two of its most beloved screen icons might have shared something deeper, something forbidden by their era. Then the story took an even darker turn. A journalist from The Advocate claimed to have uncovered evidence that Paul and Redford had secretly escaped to Tuscany together in the summer of 1982. No wives, no children, no assistants. Just the two of them in a secluded villa tucked behind towering stone walls with guards keeping everyone else out. Nell had never heard of such a trip before. Her father had never mentioned it. But the details were too specific to ignore. Shaken, she called Dorothy Hughes, her mother's longtime friend and personal assistant during the 1980s, hoping to prove it was all just rumor. But Dorothy's voice on the other end of the line shattered that hope. "Yes," Dorothy said quietly. Joanne knew. Nell froze. Dorothy continued softly. She knew about the trip. She just chose silence. She believed that if Paul had his freedom, if he could live that part of himself without fear, maybe he would come back to her. Maybe not whole, but still hers. Those words hit Nell like a punch to the gut. Her mother had known all along, and instead of exploding with rage, she had chosen to endure it, hoping love would somehow find its way back. But when Paul died, what he left behind wasn't closure. It wasn't peace. It was a fortress. A legal stronghold designed to protect his secrets and lock his family out forever. His entire empire, the Newman's own foundation, and every piece of control were handed to one man, Robert Forrester. No explanation, no letter, not even a single personal note left for the people who had shared his life. Just cold, deliberate signatures etched across the will, every line drawn like a wall between him and those who had loved him most. The final nail came at a 2009 press conference when a reporter dared to ask Robert Forrester why Paul Newman had chosen to exclude his own family from control of his estate. Forrester's reply was short, cutting, and final. "He trusted me, and I believe that is the only thing that truly matters." That single sentence dropped like a guillotine. It slammed the door shut on every question, every hope for understanding. For Nell, it was like hearing the last chapter of a story written in someone else's handwriting, and a verdict she could never appeal. Her father, the man who had sworn to live for his family and die for his family, had left them with nothing but confusion, pain, and shadows. He had built a legacy for the world, but not for the people who bore his name. And so, on September 26, 2008, in his quiet farmhouse in Westport, Connecticut, Paul Newman, the Hollywood legend with the immortal blue eyes, took his final breath. The world mourned a hero, a humanitarian, a cinematic icon, but behind the closed doors of his home, a family sat in silence, mourning something else entirely, the truth they never got to hear. When Paul Newman passed away, the entire nation stopped to mourn. TV stations played his films on loop: The Hustler, Cool Hand Luke, Butch Cassidy, and The Sundance Kid, each scene glowing with nostalgia and love. CBS aired heartfelt tributes. CNN ran a full special filled with messages from friends, co-stars, and fans who'd never even met him but swore he'd changed their lives. To the public, it was the perfect Hollywood ending: the death of a legend surrounded by a devoted wife, proud children, and a legacy built on charity and love. But what America didn't know was that behind those headlines and smiling montages, there was another story, one darker, colder, and heartbreakingly real. 3 days after her father's death, Nell Newman, his eldest daughter, got a call that made her blood run cold. The voice on the line was professional, detached from her father's private law office. "We have officially activated the will according to Mr. Newman's instructions," the caller said. "Please check your internal mailbox. The division of assets has been completed. Only a few minor clarifications remain." Nell's stomach dropped. Something in that voice, too calm, too clinical, told her something was deeply wrong. And she was right. The final will, signed just 6 weeks before Paul's death, didn't resemble the one the family had known for years. Every name that mattered most, his wife, his daughters, his sons, was gone, erased, as if they had never existed. The entire Newman estate, valued at over $600 million, including his shares in Newman's own, the real estate holdings, image rights, and film royalties, was handed over entirely to one entity, the Newman's own foundation. At first, it sounded noble, keeping his fortune in the charity that bore his name, but the twist came fast and hard. At the head of that foundation sat Robert Forrester, the man Paul had called his trusted partner, the same man who now controlled every dollar, every decision, and every piece of the Newman legacy. For Nell and her siblings, it was unthinkable. Their father, who had promised fairness and family unity, had left them with nothing, not even a message, not a word, not a goodbye note explaining his reasons. The document was legal, final, and devastating. The family's grief quickly turned to outrage. Calls were made, lawyers contacted, statements drafted, but the louder they tried to speak, the quieter the world became, because something even stranger began happening. Silence. The press, the same press that had once worshipped Paul, suddenly went mute. Not a single major outlet dared to question the will. No one asked why Joanne Woodward, the woman who had stood by him through every scandal and triumph, was left out completely. Even as she sat alone, fading in a Connecticut nursing home, her memory dissolving one day at a time. No one questioned why the Newman's own foundation, originally founded as a charitable dream, now seemed locked down by legal walls so tight that not even his own family could touch it. Nell, who had once proudly run the environmental branch of her father's foundation, received a cold notice only months later, her position terminated. No explanation, no thank you, just gone. Behind the scenes, whispers spread that she had asked too many questions about where the money was really going, about the foundation's new structure, about the mysterious, quiet legacy trust that had appeared briefly in legal drafts before disappearing entirely. But no one in power dared to dig deeper. The very media that had celebrated Paul Newman as America's golden-hearted hero suddenly acted like nothing was wrong. It was as if the story had been scrubbed clean, sealed behind velvet curtains, guarded by the same silence that had always followed him. When Nell finally spoke to the New York Times, her voice broke under the weight of everything she'd held back for years. Through tears that wouldn't stop, she said, "I never asked for a dime. I just couldn't stand seeing them turn my father into a tool and toss my mother aside like she was never part of his life." Those words hit like a thunderclap across Hollywood's polished surface. What followed wasn't an official probe, it was something more dangerous. Quietly, off the record, lawyers, journalists, and even Paul Newman's old friends started digging. What they found chilled everyone who loved him. Their conclusion was blunt and devastating. Paul Newman might not have been of sound mind when he signed his final will. Leaked medical documents from a New York inpatient clinic painted a heartbreaking picture. As early as mid-2007, Paul had begun showing clear signs of cognitive decline, memory lapses, confusion, and disorientation that sometimes left him lost in his own home. Doctors noted changes in his behavior, moments where he struggled to recognize longtime associates or forgot details about projects he had personally started. Then came May 2008. Just 3 months before he signed that final will. The medical files reportedly listed him as temporarily incapacitated for legal judgment. In any other case, that diagnosis would have voided any new legal documents. But those records? They were never acknowledged, never entered into the official court proceedings. It was as if someone had erased them before they could surface. Then came another bombshell. An anonymous insider, someone who had once worked directly with Paul's legal team, came forward to Vanity Fair with a shocking claim. They said, "I saw a handwritten letter Paul wrote to Joanne in June of 2008. According to this insider, the letter completely contradicted the will that would later strip his family of everything. In it, Paul allegedly apologized to Joanne, said he feared he might not have time to make things right, that he was being pushed to sign documents he didn't fully understand. The letter ended with a plea. If something goes wrong after I'm gone, please forgive me. But that letter never appeared in any legal file. No record, no copy, no mention. It had vanished, buried, hidden, or destroyed. The source refused to go public, terrified of the consequences. They told me to stay silent, the whistleblower confessed. And after what I saw happened to others who spoke out, I believed them. By 2019, the whispers had grown too loud to ignore. The Wall Street Journal launched a massive investigation, releasing a series of reports under one searing headline: who was really behind Paul Newman's final will? They weren't alone. The Guardian went even further, publishing a scathing exposé that called the situation the greatest theft of legacy Hollywood has ever witnessed. Reporters unearthed documents showing just how dramatically things had changed once Robert Forrester, the man Paul had named head of Newman's own foundation, took full control. Within a year, Forrester had doubled his own salary as CEO while quietly slashing budgets for nearly every charitable program the Newman family had championed. Projects Joanne and Nell had personally built, ones that supported environmental causes, education, and independent filmmakers, were either defunded or shut down entirely. Even organizations Paul had personally promised lifelong support to found themselves suddenly cut off, their contracts terminated without warning. Behind the polished image of Newman's legacy, a different reality had begun to emerge, one of power, control, and money. The empire built in Paul's name was no longer serving his vision. It was serving someone else's, and as Nell watched it all unfold, her father's name used like a brand, his image turned into a corporate logo, she couldn't shake the feeling that the man the world mourned wasn't the same man who had signed that final will. The truth, it seemed, had been rewritten. And the real Paul Newman was fading, just like his wife's memory, piece by piece, until nothing pure was left. The charities Paul had personally supported for more than 20 years were abruptly cut off. Projects that carried his name, his passion, and his promise. Even more shocking, every member of the Newman family was permanently barred from joining the foundation's board. The very family whose faces had once defined his brand was now written out completely, erased from their own legacy. By 2020, Nell couldn't stay silent any longer. She filed a petition with the Connecticut State Court, demanding that her father's will be reopened and re-examined. She wasn't asking for money, she was asking for the truth. But the court shut her down cold. Their statement read, "There is insufficient evidence to prove Paul Newman was not of sound mind when he signed the will." It seemed like the story was over, but fate wasn't done with the Newman family just yet. In late 2021, a discovery changed everything. One of Joanne Woodward's former assistants, while cleaning out old boxes from the Westport estate, stumbled across something hidden deep inside a worn copy of The Prophet by Khalil Gibran, a book both Paul and Joanne had cherished for years. Inside its yellowed pages, carefully folded and untouched by time, was a letter. A handwritten letter. The ink had faded slightly, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Paul's. The fingerprints were still visible. The message was short, but devastating. "My dearest Joanne, if I am no longer lucid enough to say this to you directly, then read it here. Everything belongs to you, from the name to the career, to the reason I still exist after all these years. If anything goes astray, believe that I did not choose it. I love you until the very end. Paul." Those words hit like a bolt of lightning. The letter carried no legal weight, but emotionally, it was undeniable proof that somewhere inside, the man the world adored had still been trying to make things right. When the story leaked, the discovery sent waves through the entertainment world. Reporters and fans alike were stunned. Could this letter mean Paul had been manipulated? That his final will had been altered under pressure? No one could prove it, but the idea refused to die. Then in 2023, during an ABC interview, a journalist asked Nell one simple question. "Do you still plan to reopen the case surrounding your father's will?" Nell paused for a long moment, then gave a small, bittersweet smile. "There are things that can't be reclaimed with paperwork," she said softly. "But I believe my father left the truth somewhere. Maybe he's still waiting for us to find it." Those words carried the quiet wisdom of someone who had seen the best and worst of love, and learned that truth doesn't always fit neatly into court files or signed pages. Perhaps what Paul Newman had spent his life hiding wasn't his fortune, his famous recipes, or even his reputation. Perhaps the real secret, the one he guarded behind that calm smile and those ocean-deep blue eyes, was simply himself, a man torn between light and shadow, a man who had lived beneath the blinding glare of fame, yet closed his eyes every night under the weight of truths he never dared to speak aloud. When the final curtain fell, when the whispers became accusations and the papers turned into battles, What remained wasn't bitterness, it wasn't defiance, it wasn't even the lawsuit that never found justice. What remained in Nell's heart was something stronger, a quiet, unbreakable love. The kind of love that doesn't disappear, even after everything else does. A daughter's loyalty to a father she'll never fully understand, but will always defend in silence. An unshakable loyalty, that's what remained. A bond of affection that no number of wills, legal papers, or erased names could ever break. No matter how many times the world tried to rewrite the story, love still lingered, stubborn, raw, and impossible to destroy. Nell Newman had once been known as her father's spiritual heir. Her name had appeared beside his on charity projects, her face on product packaging, her heart stitched into the legacy of Newman's own. She had believed, truly believed, that she would carry on her father's dream with pride and purpose. But in the end, it all vanished. Every title, every role, every symbol of connection, gone, like it had never existed at all. The only thing they couldn't erase was blood, the quiet inheritance that doesn't show up in bank statements or legal filings. It runs unseen, yet bleeds a little more with every wound that never heals. "I never stopped loving my father," Nell said softly, her voice trembling like a cracked note during her final CBS Sunday Morning interview in 2010. "No matter what he did, no matter how I was shut out of every decision, I still loved him, the way a daughter loves her father." Her words broke apart, like glass under too much weight, carrying decades of silence in every breath. Then she paused, her eyes lowered, voice fragile but certain. "And yet, love doesn't always walk hand in hand with forgiveness." That line hit hard, simple but brutal. She looked away for a moment before adding, "And truth, if left unspoken, becomes an abyss that swallows memory whole." Nell inhaled shakily, then whispered, "I believe he loved us. I want to believe that's true. But I just wish he'd been brave enough to live honestly, not with the world, but with his own family." Her words hung in the air, stripped of fury, stripped of bitterness, leaving only the crushing weight of regret. It was the sound of a daughter standing before a door that would never open again. She never explained exactly what living honestly meant. She didn't have to. The audience understood. Everyone understood. They had seen the clues scattered through decades of hidden files, burned letters, and half-whispered rumors. The unreleased correspondence between old colleagues, the love letters that never made it to their destination, the quiet hotel rooms booked under fake names, and those names that kept surfacing over and over again in the corners of Hollywood's memory. There was Scott, the broken son who had carried the burden of a truth too heavy for anyone that young to bear. There was Redford, the lifelong friend whose name pulsed through every secret letter, every late-night call, every rumor the tabloids never dared to print. And then there was Dean, another whisper from the past, another connection that blurred the line between friendship and something far deeper. All of them pieces of the same riddle, fragments of a man the world thought it knew, but never truly did. Paul Newman, the legend with the ocean blue eyes, had spent his life building walls of grace and generosity around himself. Yet buried behind those walls was a heart divided by secrets. And for Nell, the tragedy wasn't just what had been lost. It was what had been hidden. The love that could have been shared openly. The truth that might have healed instead of destroyed. She didn't speak of revenge or resentment, only of longing. The longing of a daughter who still believed in her father's soul, even if she no longer recognized the man the world celebrated. Because sometimes the cruelest thing about love isn't losing it. It's realizing it was never allowed to live freely in the first place. All of them, Scott, Redford, Dean, fragments of a puzzle that would never, ever be complete. The truth lay buried deep, sealed inside a man who took his secrets to the grave, leaving everyone else to carry the weight he couldn't face. For those left behind, the silence didn't just echo, it punished. It became a lifetime sentence handed down without warning. It wasn't only about the money, the will, or the lost inheritance. It was something far crueler. It was the shattering of memory itself. Because when a man's image becomes legend, the person he truly was fades away, and his family is left holding only the ghost of his name. For Nell, that was the hardest truth of all. When the world turned Paul Newman into an icon, it erased the father she once knew. The more people worshipped his myth, the more invisible his children became, trapped behind a story that wasn't entirely real. And so, when the curtain falls and the screen fades to black, only one quiet question lingers, whispered by everyone who's ever loved someone who hid too much. Are we truly living as ourselves before it's too late? There are nights when Nell sits alone on the porch of the old house in Westport, the same porch where her father once sat, drink in hand, staring out into the dark. The moonlight spills across the garden he used to tend, the tall maple trees swaying gently in the wind, and sometimes, just sometimes, the breeze carries with it a sound, like the faint rustle of words that were never spoken. In that silence, Nell feels it, the truth that cuts deeper than any legal betrayal or tabloid scandal. The most painful thing isn't the lost fortune, the lawsuits, or the unanswered questions. It's the emptiness, that invisible space between a father and a daughter, carved not by distance, but by silence. It's the kind of wound no time can heal, because it wasn't made by cruelty or anger, but by everything that was never said. She understands now that a daughter's love doesn't die, no matter what happens. It lives on, even in anger, even in betrayal, even in heartbreak. Love stays, reshaped and scarred, haunting every memory like a shadow that refuses to fade. But it's the silence that transforms that love into something else, something consuming. It becomes an obsession, a loop that never ends, like a river forced to flow backward, endlessly searching for the sea it was meant to reach. And deep inside, Nell still longs for one simple thing, not wealth, not recognition, not redemption, just one moment of honesty. She imagines her father, not the legend, not the movie star, but the man, sitting across from his children, finally brave enough to meet their eyes and tell them everything. The truth about who he was, who he loved, and what he hid. Because even if that truth had been painful, even if it had broken them, at least it would have been real. And in the end, that's all any of them ever wanted. Not the perfection the world demanded, but the simple, human truth of a father who could finally say, "This is me." Now, with nothing left but the scattered pieces of memory, Nell has learned to live with a truth she can never fully understand, that her father, Paul Newman, will forever remain a paradox. To the world, he's a legend, a symbol of charm, grace, and moral strength. But to his own family, he's still an unanswered riddle, a mystery wrapped in silence. Maybe that's what his real legacy is. Not the wealth, not the awards, not even the empire he built, but the emptiness he left behind, the haunting space where questions still echo, whispering through every generation. Because sometimes the truest inheritance isn't made of money or fame. It's the questions that never stop asking themselves. Do we dare to live truthfully with ourselves? Or will we choose silence, the same silence that destroyed so many hearts, until the very end? Behind every flashbulb and every glowing headline, there are letters that were never sent, children forgotten in the shadows, and a truth that may have been buried forever beside the man the world believed they truly knew. Paul Newman, the legend with the bluest eyes and the warmest smile, may have carried within him a secret so deep that not even his own family could uncover it. And now, decades later, that secret still lingers like smoke in the air, refusing to fade away. So we'll leave you with this. Have you ever wondered what it really means when someone so celebrated, so loved, and so respected hides a truth that powerful behind closed doors? What would you do if the person you idolized turned out to be a stranger in their own home? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We genuinely want to hear what you think about this hidden side of a Hollywood legend. And if this story moved you or made you see fame in a new light, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an update. Share this video with someone who still believes every legend lives a perfect life, because behind every spotlight, there's always a shadow waiting to be seen. Thank you for watching, and until next time, stay curious, stay bold, and we'll see you again in the next video.